Casey Brennan just got fired for being too cold under pressure. She is walking across the hospital parking lot with a cardboard box of her things when the sky splits open. 2 Navy helicopters are landing on the front lawn, and the crew chief is screaming a name she buried 3 years ago. Hers. In minutes, she trades hospital scrubs for a wetsuit and drops into open water to save sailors dying of hypothermia, 40 miles from shore, against a clock that does not stop for anyone. The administrator who fired her is standing in the parking lot, watching, and he has no idea who he just lost. Welcome back to Secrets of Silent Badges. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because every story on this channel hides someone the world underestimated. Drop a comment, and tell me what city or country you are listening from tonight. And if you believe quiet people can carry the loudest histories, hit that like button before we start. This is Casey's story. 6 hours before she lost her job, Casey Brennan brought a man back from the edge of a heart attack, with nothing but a defibrillator, 2 doses of epinephrine, and a voice that never once shook. The family called her a hero in the hallway. Dr. Alvarez, no relation to anyone she'd meet later that day, wrote it in the chart as textbook resuscitation. Timing, perfect. Nobody wrote down that her hands didn't shake because she had done this before, in worse water, on worse days, for a Navy that no longer knew her name. By the time her shift ended, the family had gone home and the compliment had already been forgotten by everyone except her, filed away with the 100 other quiet victories nobody at Bayview Regional ever connected to anything. "You're too cold for this job, Ms. Brennan." Daniel Wren said it like he was reading a weather report. Casey stood in front of his desk, hands folded, scrub still smelling of antiseptic from a 12-hour shift. "I kept a man alive for 40 minutes with a chest tube and a prayer," she said. "That's not cold. That's control." Wren didn't look up from his clipboard. He was the hospital's new operations director, 3 months into the job, already feared for the wrong reasons. "Control isn't the same as compassion," he said. "Patients say you don't comfort them. You just fix them." Casey had heard variations of this complaint before, from her chief in the Gulf, from her father, from a therapist she stopped seeing after 4 sessions. "I fix them," she repeated. "That's the job." "Not anymore." Wren slid a folder across the desk. Termination paperwork, already signed by HR. "Effective today. Security will walk you out." She didn't argue. Arguing wasted air. And air was something she had learned to ration a long time ago, in places Wren would never understand. "Can I ask why now?" she said, because some small stubborn part of her needed the reason spoken out loud. "Budget review," Wren said. "You're the highest paid RN on the floor with the lowest patient satisfaction scores. It's not personal." "It's my paycheck," Casey said. "It's very personal." Wren finally looked up, and for a second something almost like doubt crossed his face. Then he smoothed it away, the way men like him always did. "For what it's worth," he said. "Some of the other nurses say you never talk about yourself. No husband, no kids, no hobbies anyone's ever heard of. It makes people uneasy." "I read," Casey said. "I run. I don't see how that's relevant to patient outcomes." "It isn't," Wren admitted. "But hospitals aren't just outcomes. They're people, and you don't let people in." She almost told him then. Almost said the words that had been sitting behind her teeth for 3 years, the ones about the ocean and the tether, and the man she couldn't save fast enough. She swallowed them instead, the way she swallowed most things. "Security will walk you out," he repeated, and picked his pen back up, already moving on to the next name on his list. In the hallway outside Wren's office, a charge nurse named Priya caught her arm before she could reach the stairwell. "He actually did it," Priya said, eyes wide. "After everything you did for the Delgado kid last week." "Budget review," Casey said, repeating Wren's words without inflection. "That's garbage and you know it," Priya said. "You're the only nurse on this floor who doesn't panic when things go bad. That should be worth something." "Apparently not enough," Casey said, and managed something close to a smile, because Priya deserved that much even on a day like this one. "Where will you go?" Priya asked. "I don't know yet," Casey said, which was true in a way Priya couldn't possibly understand, because in the next 4 hours the answer to that question would involve 52-degree water and a squadron she'd tried for 3 years to forget. She packed her locker in 6 minutes. One photo, face down before she even looked at it, a pair of running shoes, a coffee mug with a chipped rim that said "Hoo-yah" in faded letters, which nobody at Bayview Regional had ever asked her about. For half a second, standing alone in the empty locker room, she let herself remember the woman who had earned that mug. Rescue swimmer school, week 4, the instructor who told her she'd wash out by Friday. She hadn't washed out. She had finished top of her class, one of 4 women in 11 years to make it through that particular pipeline, and she had never once told anyone at this hospital. She remembered the pool deck at Pensacola, the drown-proofing test where instructors bound her ankles and wrists and made her float, then swim, then survive being dunked by men twice her size, pretending to be panicking victims. She remembered surfacing with her lungs on fire and an instructor screaming that she wasn't done, not even close. And something in her had simply refused to argue with him. She remembered graduation day, her mother crying in the stands, her father saying nothing at all, which from him had been its own kind of applause. None of that lived in her personnel file at Bayview Regional. None of it explained the woman Wren had just fired for being too quiet, too controlled, too much like the ocean itself, calm on the surface and capable of anything underneath. A security guard named Miguel walked her to the exit, apologizing the whole way like it was his fault. "He's been doing this to people for weeks," Miguel muttered. "Cutting staff, blaming morale. It's not you, Casey." "I know," she said, and meant it mostly. The automatic doors slid open to a gray afternoon. Rain threatened but hadn't committed. She crossed the lot toward her car, cardboard box balanced against her hip. 3 years of careful invisibility ending in a folder with her name misspelled on the tab. Brennan, C. Not Brennan, Casey. Not Petty Officer First Class. Casey Brennan, Naval Air Crewman, rescue swimmer, 7 years of service, 2 combat deployments, one name she had not spoken out loud since the funeral. She was 30 feet from her car when the air changed. It wasn't sound first. It was pressure, a physical shove against her eardrums that she felt before she consciously heard the rotors. Then the sound arrived, huge and layered, 2 distinct engines beating the sky into submission. She looked up. 2 matte gray helicopters were dropping toward the hospital's front lawn, blades chopping the low clouds apart, landing lights strobing through the mist. Not medevac birds, not the civilian air ambulance that sometimes used the helipad on the roof. Navy gray, MH-60S Nighthawks. The tail markings told her everything before her mind caught up. HSC-7, Dusty Dogs, her old squadron, out of Naval Station Norfolk. The box slipped from her hip. She didn't notice it hit the pavement. Every muscle in her body remembered how to stand at attention before her brain gave the order. The near helicopter settled onto the grass, rotor wash flattening the flower beds Wren had proudly installed last spring, sending petals and mulch spinning across the parking lot in a small, violent storm. The side door slid open before the wheels fully touched down. A man in a flight suit jumped out, ducking under the blades. One hand pressed to his helmet to hold the comm gear against his ear. He scanned the crowd gathering at the hospital entrance, nurses and orderlies and a security guard who had frozen mid-apology. Then his eyes found her. "Brennan!" he shouted over the engines. "Casey Brennan!" She didn't move. 3 years of practiced stillness held her in place, even as her pulse slammed against her ribs. Miguel turned to her, confused. "You know these guys?" "Brennan!" the man shouted again, closer now, jogging across the wet grass. Up close she recognized him. Chief Petty Officer Ray Ostrowski, her old aircrew coordinator, 10 pounds heavier. One new scar above his eyebrow. Same impatient scowl. "Ray," she said, and the name came out rough, like a door opening on a hinge that hadn't moved in years. "Thank God," Ostrowski said. "We tried your old number. Your CO's office had this address on file from your discharge paperwork. We didn't know if you'd even still... What happened?" Her voice had already dropped into a register she hadn't used at Bayview Regional. Flat, fast, no wasted words. "Fishing trawler capsized 40 miles east. 6 crew in the water, hour 20 and 52-degree water. We pulled 2. Hypothermic, unresponsive, 1 in cardiac arrest on the ride back. Doc Reyes is out with the flu. Our backup swimmer blew his shoulder out on the last hoist. We've got 4 more people in the water and no qualified rescue swimmer." Casey's mouth went dry. "I'm not current," she said. "I haven't been in a hoist harness in 3 years." You're the only qualified swimmer within 200 miles who can be airborne in the next 4 minutes, Ostrowski said. Command authorized emergency recall. I need an answer now, not a resume. Behind her, she heard the hospital doors open again. Daniel Wren stepped out onto the sidewalk, drawn by the noise, phone already raised to film the spectacle for whatever board meeting he planned to weaponize it in. What is going on here? Wren called out, voice pitched for an audience. This is private property. You cannot land aircraft on... Casey didn't turn around. 4 sailors were in 52-degree water. The clock had already been running for over an hour. She knew exactly what that water did to a human body, because she had pulled bodies out of it before. Some breathing, some not. I need a wetsuit, she said, and a headset that isn't 20 years out of date. Ostrowski grinned like a man watching a ghost come back to life. Both on the bird, he said. Let's move. She ran toward the helicopter, rotor wash tearing at her scrub top. 3 years of careful smallness burning off her like fog under a hard sun. Behind her, Wren was still shouting something about liability, about protocol, about a woman he thought he understood. He had no idea he had just fired a war. The MH-60S climbed hard, banking east over gray water that stretched to a horizon Casey hadn't looked at directly in 3 years. Inside the cabin, Ostrowski passed her a wetsuit bag and a headset, both smelling of neoprene and jet fuel, a combination that hit her harder than she expected. Her hands moved through the motions without instruction. Zipper, seal check, hood. Fins clipped to her harness. Her body remembered every step, even while her mind was still catching up to the fact that this was real. Sit rep, she said into the headset, and the word came out clean, clipped, a language she hadn't spoken since her discharge papers were signed. Ostrowski passed her the details in the same rhythm. The trawler Sea Fortune had lost engine power in rough swells before dawn, taken water over the stern, and rolled within 11 minutes. 6 crew aboard. 2 recovered so far, both severely hypothermic, 1 now in cardiac arrest aboard the second helicopter, already inbound to Portsmouth Naval Medical Center. 4 crew remained in the water. Water temperature 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Time in water now approaching 90 minutes. Casey ran the numbers the way she used to run them at 3 a.m. over the Gulf. Cold math that didn't care about feelings. At 52 degrees, exhaustion and unconsciousness could occur in under an hour without flotation. Survival time without a survival suit rarely stretched past 2 hours. 90 minutes meant the 4 sailors still in the water were somewhere between borderline and critical, and every minute she spent thinking was a minute she wasn't in the water pulling them out. Any of them wearing survival suits? She asked. Negative. Deck crew. No time to suit up before she rolled. PFDs? 2 confirmed, 2 unknown. Water state? 6-foot swells, wind chop on top of that. Coast Guard cutters 40 minutes out. They're the closest surface asset. We're first on scene. That meant no boat to warm survivors in, no dry deck to work from, nothing but a hoist cable and a helicopter that could only stay on station until its fuel gauge said otherwise. Every rescue swimmer training evolution she had ever run had drilled the same lesson into her until it stopped feeling like a rule and started feeling like instinct. In cold water, speed matters more than comfort, and the swimmer who hesitates loses the survivor before the sea does. She closed her eyes for 1 second, just long enough to shove the fear down into the place she used to keep it, a locked compartment behind her sternum that she'd thought had rusted shut for good. ETA? 6 minutes. 6 minutes. She used the time to check her gear twice, the way she'd been trained, the way that had kept her alive through 2 deployments, and 1 funeral she still couldn't think about without her jaw locking. Her mind went, unbidden, to Jordan. Jordan Faust. Her swim partner for 3 years. Steady hands, terrible jokes, the kind of laugh that carried across a flight deck. He'd gone into water like this once, off the coast of Bahrain, chasing a downed pilot in a storm that shouldn't have cleared them for flight. She'd gone in after him when his line snapped. She'd found him. She hadn't found him in time. The Navy had called it equipment failure. Casey had spent 3 years calling it her failure. For not checking his tether twice instead of once. For trusting a system on a night when the system had already started to fail everyone. She still remembered the exact color of the water that night, black under a moonless sky, and the exact second the tension on the line went slack instead of taut. She remembered diving anyway, Past the depth the manual said was survivable without extra gear, because the manual had never met Jordan Faust and didn't know what he was worth. She remembered finding him 11 minutes later, and knowing from the stillness of his body before she even touched him that 11 minutes had been 10 too many. The Board of Inquiry had cleared her. She had never once accepted the verdict. At the funeral, his mother had hugged her and thanked her for trying, and Casey had stood there in her dress blues, accepting gratitude she felt she hadn't earned, for a rescue that had ended in a flag folded into a triangle instead of a man walking off a flight deck under his own power. She had walked away from the squadron 4 months later. Nursing school felt like penance. Bright cobalt scrubs felt like a costume she could hide inside, a version of saving people that came with no ocean, no tether, no chance of losing someone to 52-degree water again. 2 minutes, Ostrowski said. You good? I'm good, she said, and made herself believe it, because the alternative was 4 sailors dying, while she indulged a grief she'd been carrying alone for 3 years. Static crackled through her headset. A transmission patched over from the second helicopter already headed to Portsmouth. Dusty 2 to Dusty 1, be advised. Our cardiac arrest patient regained a pulse at -6 of CPR. Core temp 31 Celsius on arrival. Handing off to Portsmouth Trauma now. Copy, Dusty 2, good work, Ostrowski answered, then glanced at Casey. See? Sometimes the cold ones come back. She didn't answer. She was watching the water instead, gray and endless, thinking about margins and minutes and how little separated a rescue from a recovery. The helicopter dropped altitude, and through the open door she saw it. Gray swells cresting 6 feet, white caps tearing at the surface, and far below, a single flare of orange, a life vest catching the fading light. Swimmer ready, she said, clipping into the hoist line, adjusting her mask, feeling the old muscle memory click into place 1 joint at a time. You're cleared, Ostrowski said. Go get them, Brennan. She went out the door into 52-degree water for the first time in 3 years, and the cold hit her like a fist, exactly like she remembered, exactly like she'd feared it would. She surfaced, spat water, and swam. The first sailor was 30 yards out, face half submerged, PFD keeping him afloat but not keeping him conscious. She reached him in under a minute, rolled him onto his back, checked his airway, felt a pulse that was there but thin, thready, a heart working too hard in a body too cold. Got one, she radioed. Unresponsive, pulse present, hoisting now. She clipped the rescue strap under his arms, gave the hand signal, and watched the cable snap taut, lifting him clear of the water while she treaded in place, scanning for the next flare of orange, in a sea that was doing everything it could to hide 4 dying men in plain sight. Somewhere behind her, on a hospital sidewalk 200 miles away, Daniel Wren was probably still filming an empty parking lot, congratulating himself on a decision he understood nothing about. Out here, none of that mattered. Only the water mattered. Only the clock mattered. She found the second sailor, a woman barely conscious, muttering someone's name over and over, lips blue, shivering violently, which Casey noted with something close to relief. Violent shivering meant the body was still fighting. It was the sailors who had stopped shivering that scared her. Second swimmer secured, she radioed, fitting the strap, giving the signal, watching another body rise into the sky. 2 down, 2 to go. The clock kept moving, indifferent to her history, indifferent to Jordan, indifferent to everything except the temperature of the water and the time a human heart could keep beating inside it. Her arms burned. Her legs had gone from cold to something past cold, a deep ache that spread from her thighs into her lower back with every kick. She ignored it the way she had been trained to ignore it, filing the pain under information instead of instruction, a fact about her body rather than a command from it. She keyed her radio once more before turning. Ray, give me the search pattern on the last 2. I don't want to waste strokes. Trawler captain says they went over the port side together, holding on to a cooler lid, Ostrowski answered. Currents pulling northeast at half a knot. Search box is 200 meters. You're 12 o'clock. She turned toward that heading and started swimming. Faster now, because somewhere in the back of her mind, a countdown had started that she couldn't silence. 90 minutes in the water. Every 7 more meant another 10% chance of a heart giving out for good. She had 4 sailors. She had 2 recovered already. She had maybe 20 more minutes before the math turned completely against her. She swam harder. The third sailor wasn't moving at all. Casey found him face down, PFD keeping his body afloat, but his head lolling forward into the water with every swell, and she knew before she reached him that this was the one the checklist called critical. She flipped him face up, cleared his airway, and pressed 2 fingers against his carotid artery, counting in her head the way she'd been trained to count. Patient, precise, refusing to let panic speed up the numbers. Nothing. No pulse. No breath. Core temperature dropping by the second in water this cold, which meant one thing every rescue swimmer learns early and never forgets. He is not dead until he is warm and dead. Sailor 3. No pulse, no respiration. She radioed, voice flat, professional, the only tone that kept her hands steady. Beginning rescue breaths, hoisting for CPR in transit. Copy. We're bringing the strop down now, Ostrowski answered, and she heard something new in his voice. An edge of memory, because they had both lost a swimmer once to water exactly this cold, exactly this indifferent. She tilted the sailor's head back, sealed her mouth over his, and forced 2 breaths into lungs that felt like they belonged to a stranger, cold and unresisting. Nothing. She clipped the strop under his arms with fingers gone half numb, signaled the hoist, and rode up with him, refusing to let go of his jaw, refusing to stop the rescue breaths even as the cable dragged them both up through freezing spray. Inside the cabin, the crew chief, a young petty officer named Alvarez who looked barely out of his teens, froze at the sight of a body with no visible signs of life. Is he... Alvarez started. He's hypothermic and pulseless, not dead, Casey snapped, dragging the sailor onto the cabin floor, tilting his chin, sealing her mouth over his again. Compressions. Now. I need hands. Alvarez didn't move. His training had covered flight operations, not full arrest resuscitation on a moving aircraft. Now, petty officer, Casey said, and something in her voice cut through his hesitation like a blade. He dropped to his knees beside her, hands trembling, and began compressions where she guided them, counting aloud. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths. The oldest rhythm in emergency medicine, performed in a shaking aircraft over open ocean, with a man whose heart had already stopped once from cold alone. Core temp is the enemy here, Casey said between breaths, half to Alvarez, half to herself, reciting doctrine that had once been drilled into her until it lived in her spine. Rough handling can trigger cardiac arrhythmia in severe hypothermia. Keep him horizontal, minimal jostling. We warm him gently or we lose him twice. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck again between compression cycles, feeling for anything, a flutter, a twitch, evidence that 30 compressions had moved even 1 drop of blood through a body this cold. Estimated core temp? Alvarez asked, voice tight, hands never stopping their rhythm. Somewhere south of 86 Fahrenheit if he's this unresponsive, Casey said. Below 82, the heart can go into fibrillation just from us moving him. That's why we go slow on the turns and fast on the compressions. Cold buys us time on the brain. It doesn't buy us anything on the heart. She stripped his soaked outer layer, wrapped him in the aircraft's thermal blanket, careful to insulate his torso and head first, the areas that bled heat fastest, leaving limbs for last. Exactly the way field protocol demanded, and exactly the way most people, even trained medics, got wrong under pressure. 2 more rescue breaths. Alvarez counted compressions, sweat cutting through the cold on his forehead, despite the open door and the freezing wind screaming past them. Come on, Casey muttered. Not a prayer exactly. More a command aimed at a heart that had already tried to quit once. Come on. On the 4th cycle, the sailor's chest hitched. A cough, wet and violent, water spraying from his lips as his body convulsed back into consciousness. Eyes rolling open, unfocused, terrified. Pulse, Alvarez said, hand still on the man's neck, disbelief cracking his voice. I've got a pulse. Keep him warm. Keep him still. Watch for arrhythmia, Casey said, already moving toward the door, already scanning the water below for the 4th sailor, because 3 recovered still meant 1 left behind in 52-degree water, with a clock she could feel ticking against her own ribs. 4th swimmer, last known position 200 meters northeast, Ostrowski called from the cockpit. We're low on fuel window. 15 minutes before we have to break for tanker rendezvous. 15 minutes. Casey clipped back into the hoist line without answering, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already obvious. 15 minutes to find one more sailor in 6-foot swells, in water that had already taken one heart and nearly kept it. She went back out the door, back into the cold, and for the first time since Jordan, she didn't feel the fear as something separate from her. She felt it as fuel. She swam the search box in long, clean lines, the way she'd been drilled to do it, ignoring the burn building in her shoulders, scanning wave troughs for any color that didn't belong to the sea. 12 minutes gone. Nothing but gray water, and the ache of a body pushed harder than it had been pushed in 3 years. Then, on the edge of the search box, she saw it. Not orange, white, a cooler lid, bobbing upside down, and a hand gripping its edge with the kind of desperate strength that only comes right before a body gives out completely. "Visual on Sailor 4, she radioed, already swimming toward him, lungs burning, arms screaming. Conscious, holding onto debris. 50 meters. She reached him as his grip finally began to slip, fingers white and curled like claws around the plastic edge. "I've got you," she said, wrapping an arm under his, keeping his head above the swell. "You did the hard part. Let me do the rest." He couldn't speak. He only nodded, teeth chattering so hard the sound carried over the wind. "Strop coming down," she radioed, fitting it under his arms with hands that had gone almost entirely numb, giving the signal, watching him rise clear of the water with 3 minutes left on Ostrowski's fuel window. She rode the last hoist up herself, dropping onto the cabin floor soaked and shaking. 4 sailors alive around her, one of them breathing because a heart had agreed, just barely, to keep going. Alvarez looked at her the whole flight back, saying nothing, doing the math himself. A hospital nurse who moved through cardiac arrest like she'd done it 1,000 times. A woman who spoke in radio protocol instead of bedside manner. A stranger who had gone from a parking lot to open ocean in 11 minutes flat. When the helicopter finally touched down at Naval Station Norfolk, medical teams swarmed the cabin, stabilizing all 4 sailors for transport, calling out vitals, praising a rescue that should not have gone as well as it did. Casey sat against the bulkhead, wrapped in a thermal blanket of her own now, watching the chaos with the flat exhaustion of someone who had spent every reserve she had left. Ostrowski crouched beside her, voice low enough that only she could hear it. "Command's going to want a full debrief," he said. "And a certain administrator back at Bayview is already calling the base, asking who authorized landing military aircraft on his lawn." "Let him call," Casey said. Alvarez, still shaking off the last of the CPR, glanced at her one more time before medical pulled him away for his own evaluation, and asked the question that would follow her for the rest of the week, the question nobody at Bayview Regional had ever thought to ask. "Who is she?" Ostrowski, watching the medical teams carry 4 living sailors off his aircraft, didn't look away from Casey when he answered. "She used to be the best swimmer in this squadron," he said. "We just found out she still is." 200 miles away, Daniel Wren was standing in his office with his phone against his ear, listening to a Navy public affairs officer explain, in the flattest tone imaginable, that yes, 2 military aircraft had been authorized to land at his hospital, and yes, the woman he had fired that afternoon was currently being credited with saving 4 lives off the coast of Virginia. "That's not possible," Wren said. "She's a nurse, a mediocre one, according to her file." "Sir," the officer said, "I'm just reading you what came across my desk. Command wants to know if Bayview Regional plans to issue a statement, given that this happened on hospital property during business hours." Wren set the phone down slowly, staring at the folder still open on his desk, the one with her name misspelled on the tab, and felt, for the first time in 3 months, the specific cold of a decision he could not take back. Casey didn't know any of that yet. She was still sitting against the bulkhead of a Navy helicopter, wrapped in a blanket, watching 4 sailors breathe because she had refused to let the ocean keep them. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt something that wasn't guilt. It felt almost like coming home. And for the first time in 3 years, home didn't feel like something she had to apologize for wanting back. Naval Station Norfolk smelled like jet fuel and salt, and Casey stood in a debrief room she hadn't seen in 3 years, wrapped in a borrowed flight suit 2 sizes too big, giving a statement to a lieutenant commander who kept glancing at her file like it didn't match the woman in front of him. "Petty Officer Brennan, separated 4 years ago," Honorable discharge, the lieutenant commander read aloud, more to himself than to her. No note in here about a return to service. There isn't one, Casey said. I got recalled off a hospital parking lot 4 hours ago. So we've heard. He set the file down. 4 sailors alive because of it. Command wants your statement clean and your face nowhere near a camera until public affairs decides how to handle this. That's fine by me, Casey said. I didn't do it for cameras. Ostrowski leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the exchange with the particular patience of a man who had known her before any of this had happened. She never did anything for cameras, he said. That was always half the problem. The lieutenant commander almost smiled, then caught himself, professional again. You'll need a full flight physical if command decides to extend the recall. Given today, I don't think that decision is really in question anymore. The lieutenant commander slid a second folder across the table, thinner than the first. This is a temporary recall order. 90 days renewable. Full pay grade restored at Petty Officer First Class. Command's already talking about a longer conversation once the 90 days are up, but nobody wants to rush you into a decision 3 hours after you nearly died in the same water that took Petty Officer Faust. Hearing Jordan's name spoken out loud in an official room, in an official tone, hit her harder than she expected. She kept her face still, the way she'd trained herself to, but Ostrowski noticed anyway. He always had. You don't have to sign anything today, Ostrowski said. Nobody's going to think less of you if you walk back into that hospital and stay a nurse. I know, Casey said, and picked up the pen anyway, because for the first time in 3 years the decision didn't feel like it was being made for her by guilt. It felt like it was being made by her. She signed the recall order, and something in her chest loosened that had been clenched tight since a funeral 3 years earlier. Casey's phone, recovered from her locker at Bayview and delivered by a young ensign who clearly had no idea what he was carrying, buzzed twice on the table between them. 2 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. A voicemail transcript already populating on the screen, courtesy of an app she'd forgotten she'd installed. This is Daniel Wren from Bayview Regional. I need you to call me back regarding your employment status. There may have been a miscommunication about your termination. Casey stared at the words for a long moment. Miscommunication, she said out loud, and something in her voice made Ostrowski straighten up. What is it? Nothing, she said, pocketing the phone. Just a man finding out the ocean doesn't care about his budget spreadsheet. Ostrowski studied her for a moment, the way he used to study weather reports before a mission, looking for the thing underneath the thing everyone else saw. You know, he said, when you left the squadron, half of us figured you'd come back within a year. Faust's death wasn't your fault, Casey. It never was. I know a piece of paper from a board of inquiry never fixed that for you, but maybe today did something the paper couldn't. Maybe, Casey said, and let it sit there, unresolved. Because some wounds didn't close just because someone finally said the right words out loud. Some of them needed time in the water first. 3 hours later, in a different building entirely, Daniel Wren sat across from Bayview Regional's board of directors, sweating through a shirt that had been pressed that morning with the confidence of a man who thought his biggest problem that day would be quarterly numbers. Explain to me, said Board Chair Eleanor Voss, how you managed to fire the single most qualified emergency responder on your staff on the same day 2 military helicopters landed on our lawn to recruit her for an active rescue. I didn't know her background, Wren said. Her file said nothing about military service. Her file, Voss said, listed 7 commendations under a blank line labeled prior experience, which either means someone scrubbed her record for privacy reasons, or it means you never bothered to read past the complaints column before deciding who deserved to keep their job. Another board member, an older man named Dr. Castellano, who had sat on the board for 11 years and rarely spoke, cleared his throat. I reviewed the footage from the parking lot this morning, he said. The way she moved toward that aircraft, the way she gave orders to a Navy chief twice her rank without hesitating, that's not something you learn in nursing school, Daniel. That's something the military spends years building into a person, and you fired her over a satisfaction survey. Wren had no answer for that. Voss folded her hands on the table. We built our reputation on being the community's safety net. Today, you took the person who embodied that safety net better than anyone on this staff and threw her away over a spreadsheet. I want a plan on my desk by morning for how you intend to fix this, and it had better involve more than an apology. He had built his entire operating philosophy around numbers that fit neatly into columns. Patient satisfaction scores, staffing ratios, complaint tallies, and none of those columns had ever once contained a field for what a person had survived to become who they were. The Navy's Public Affairs Office called this building 4 times in the last 2 hours, Voss continued. Local news has the story. A woman fired for being cold saved 4 lives in water cold enough to stop a human heart. That headline writes itself, Mr. Wren, and it does not put you in it favorably. I'll rehire her, Wren said quickly. Immediately. Full back pay. You'll try, Voss said. Whether she says yes is no longer up to you. Outside, storm clouds that had been building off the coast all afternoon finally broke, rain lashing sideways against the windows of a building that had no idea it was about to need every trauma bed it had. At Naval Station Norfolk, a new alert crackled through the operations center 40 minutes later, cutting off every other conversation in the room. All available SAR assets. This is Coast Guard Sector Virginia. We have a passenger ferry, the Chesapeake Runner, 42 souls aboard, taking on water 2 miles off Cape Henry. Storm surge has capsized the vessel partially, survivors in the water and clinging to the hull. Requesting immediate helicopter support. Casey was on her feet before the announcement finished, 3 years of hospital quiet burning off her completely. 42 people, she said, in this water, in this storm. Water temps dropped to 49 degrees with the front that just came through, the operations officer said, reading off a screen. Wind gusting to 35 knots. Coast Guard's launching everything they've got, but they need Navy air support to close the gap. You're the only qualified swimmer on this base who isn't already committed to another tasking. Ostrowski looked at her, and for the first time all day, there was no ghost in his expression, only a question. You just spent your morning getting fired and your afternoon in 52-degree water, he said. Nobody would fault you for sitting this one out. Casey was already reaching for the wetsuit she'd worn 12 hours a lifetime ago, the same one still damp from the Sea Fortune rescue, and she didn't hesitate answering him. 42 people don't care how my day started, she said. Get me in the air. The storm outside had already dropped visibility to a quarter mile. Somewhere out past the breakers, a ferry full of families was rolling in swells that would kill most of them within the hour if nobody reached them first. And the clock on that particular truth had already started counting down the second the first wave broke over the rail. The MH-60S punched through rain that hit the windshield like gravel, rotors straining against gusts that pushed the aircraft sideways every few seconds. ETA 4 minutes, the pilot called back. Conditions are ugly. Coast Guard's Jayhawk is already on scene, working the starboard side survivors. We're taking the port side and anyone who went overboard forward. Casey checked her gear with hands that had gone from shaking with adrenaline to perfectly steady, the way they always did once the moment actually arrived. Through the open door, lit by the aircraft's searchlight cutting through sheets of rain, she saw the Chesapeake Runner listing hard to starboard, half her hull already submerged, passengers clinging to railings and overturned life rafts, some in the water entirely, orange life vests strobing in and out of 6-foot swells that seemed determined to swallow every light they touched. I count at least 15 in the water, Casey radioed. Multiple children among them. Her stomach dropped at the word children, but she didn't let it slow her hands. Copy 15 plus, Ostrowski answered. Coast Guard's got 6 aboard already. You're cleared for the water. Your discretion on order of recovery. Kids first, then hypothermia critical adults, then everyone else, Casey said, already clipping into the hoist. Standard triage. Go. She hit the water, and the cold nearly stole her breath even through the wetsuit. 49 degrees with wind chop driving spray into her mask every few seconds. Visibility dropping to almost nothing between swells. She found a boy first, maybe 9 years old, clinging to a life ring with both arms locked so tight around it that his fingers had gone rigid, screaming for someone named Mom in a voice already going hoarse. I've got you, Casey said, forcing calm into every syllable. The same voice she'd used on Alvarez that morning. The same voice she'd once used to talk a panicking pilot through a night water landing off Bahrain. What's your name? T. Tyler, he managed through chattering teeth. Tyler, I need you to let go of the ring and hold on to me instead. Can you do that for me? He shook his head, terror overriding everything. I know it's scary, Casey said, keeping her voice level even as a swell broke over both their heads. "But that ring can't fly. I can. Hold on to my harness, and in about 90 seconds you're going to be warm and dry and looking down at this water instead of swimming in it." Something in her tone reached him. She recognized the particular flavor of his fear, the same wide-eyed disbelief she'd seen in grown men during her deployments. The moment a person's mind finally accepts that the ground, or the deck, or the ring they've been clinging to was never actually going to save them, and that trusting a stranger is now the only option left. His fingers loosened, then locked around her harness strap instead, and she signaled for the hoist, riding up with him pressed against her chest, shielding him from the worst of the wind with her own body. "Where's my mom?" Tyler asked, teeth still chattering, eyes wide and searching the chaos below. "We're going to find her," Casey said, meaning it, refusing to let a single ounce of doubt into her voice, because a 9-year-old boy did not need her uncertainty on top of his fear. "I promise you. We are looking." She handed him off inside the cabin to a corpsman who wrapped him immediately in thermal blankets, then went back out without waiting to be asked, because there were 14 more people in that water, and the storm wasn't slowing down to let her catch her breath. The next 20 minutes blurred into a rhythm she remembered from deployments. Dive. Locate. Secure. Signal. Surface. Repeat. Her body running on training laid down years before this storm existed. She found an elderly man barely conscious. Hypothermia advanced enough that his shivering had already stopped, the most dangerous sign in the field, and got him into the strop with seconds to spare before a swell would have separated them entirely. His lips had gone a shade of blue-gray she recognized instantly, the color of a body shutting down non-essential systems to protect the heart and brain, rationing warmth the way a sinking ship rations power to the last working pumps. She checked his pupils, sluggish but reactive, checked his pulse, faint but present, and made the split-second call that he needed evacuation before anyone else in the water, shivering or not, because a person who has stopped shivering has already lost the argument with the cold and started losing the argument with time itself. Elderly male, non-shivering, pulse-thready, priority evac, she radioed, already fitting the strop under his arms with hands gone clumsy from her own building exhaustion. Watch him closely on the ride up. Hypothermic hearts don't tolerate rough handling. She found a mother, treading water one-handed while holding her unconscious toddler above the surface with the other arm, strength born entirely of a kind of love that ignored what her body was actually capable of. "I've got both of you," Casey said, taking the child first because airway always came first, checking the tiny chest for breath and finding it, thin, but present. "You did everything right. Let me finish it." She surfaced the toddler, cleared a small amount of water from his mouth with 2 fingers, and felt him cough weakly against her palm, a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. She signaled for the strop, rode up with the child sealed against her chest to keep him from the worst of the wind, and handed him to a corpsman before diving straight back down the cable for the mother, who had gone quiet in the water, exhaustion finally winning the argument her body had been having with the ocean for the last 20 minutes. "Stay with me," Casey said, hooking an arm under the woman's chin, kicking hard toward the surface even as a swell tried to drive them both under. "Your son needs you dry more than he needs you brave. Let me be brave for both of you right now." The woman's eyes fluttered open just enough to find Casey's, some fierce animal instinct, recognizing safety even through the haze of hypothermia. And she nodded once before going still again. Breathing, alive, done fighting, because she finally had permission to stop. Casey signaled the hoist and rode up beside her, refusing to let go of her collar the entire ascent, watching the woman's chest rise and fall the whole way, counting breaths instead of seconds, because seconds had never once told her anything useful about whether a person was going to make it. Between the 4th and 5th recovery, her hoist cable jammed for 11 seconds that felt like 11 minutes. The mechanism grinding against sand or debris caught somewhere in the drum, and she hung suspended halfway up the cable in howling wind with a hypothermic teenager clipped to her harness, both of them swinging like a pendulum over black water. "Cable's fouled," the crew chief called down, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Working it now. Take your time and get it right," Casey said, forcing steadiness into her own voice for the sake of the girl shaking against her chest, even as her mind ran through every version of what happened if the cable failed completely. The teenager, a girl named Rosa who couldn't have been older than 16, buried her face against Casey's shoulder and whispered something Casey almost didn't catch over the wind. Are we going to fall? No, Casey said, with a certainty she didn't entirely feel, but knew Rosa needed to hear anyway. This cable has held people through worse storms than this one. It's just being stubborn. We're going to wait it out together, and then we're going to laugh about how loud you screamed when we get there. Rosa let out something between a sob and a laugh, and Casey held her tighter, thinking briefly and involuntarily of Jordan's tether snapping in water just like this, refusing to let that memory become a prophecy for anyone else ever again. We're not going anywhere, she repeated, mostly for herself this time. The cable freed itself on the 12th second, jerking them upward hard enough to knock the breath from both of them, and Casey held on to Rosa through the jolt with an arm gone entirely numb from cold, refusing to let go even when her fingers stopped answering her properly. By the time the aircraft reached its fuel limit, they had recovered 11 survivors between both helicopters. 3 more pulled aboard a Coast Guard cutter that had finally closed the distance, and 1 still missing, a man last seen near the ferry's stern before it rolled completely. We have to break off, the pilot called back, voice apologetic in a way that told Casey he hated the words as much as she did. We're bingo fuel. Cutter's taking over the search for the last survivor. Casey looked out at the black water one more time, thinking of Jordan, thinking of every night she had told herself she should have stayed in the water 30 more seconds, 60 more seconds, however long it would have taken to change an outcome the ocean had already decided. This time, she let the aircraft turn for home, because 11 people were alive in the cabin around her, and staying to chase a 12th into water that would kill her too helped nobody at all. It was a lesson 3 years, and 1 funeral too late. But she understood it now in a way she hadn't before tonight. The Chesapeake Runners' survivors, cold, injured, some critical, needed a hospital close enough and equipped enough to receive them before hypothermia or trauma finished what the storm had started. Nearest Level 1 Trauma Center, Ostrowski said, already relaying coordinates to the pilot. Bayview Regional, 15 minutes out. Casey almost laughed at the particular cruelty of it, the storm delivering her, soaked and freezing and technically still employed by the Navy for the first time in 3 years, back to the exact hospital that had fired her that same morning. Of course it is, she said, and began preparing the cabin for handoff, because 11 survivors didn't care about irony any more than the ocean had. Bayview Regional's ambulance bay lit up like a stage the moment the helicopter's spotlight swept across it, rain hammering the tarmac, trauma teams already staged and waiting because Norfolk had radioed ahead with a patient count that turned the entire emergency department into a single coordinated machine. Casey rode the descent standing at the cabin door, scanning the crowd below out of habit, and found Daniel Wren standing at the edge of the bay, under an umbrella that the wind had already turned half inside out, exactly where the cameras that had followed the story all evening could catch him watching his own board's decision play out in real time. The moment her boots hit wet pavement, a trauma nurse named Fatima, someone Casey had worked beside for over a year, froze mid-stride at the sight of her. Casey? You're supposed to be gone. Security walked you out this morning. Long day, Casey said, already moving toward the first stretcher, calling out vitals to the receiving team in the same flat, precise cadence she'd used over open water an hour earlier. Hypothermic adult male, core temp estimated low 80s, pulse present but thready, handle him like glass. Fatima blinked, then fell into step beside her without another question, because whatever had happened to Casey Brennan since that morning, the woman in front of her clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Rewarming protocol, Casey said, moving down the line of stretchers with Fatima at her shoulder. Anyone under 90 degrees core temp goes to warmed IV fluids and forced air blankets first. No hot packs directly on skin. That causes peripheral vasodilation and can trigger afterdrop, dropping their core temp even further right when we think we're helping. Cardiac monitoring on all of them. Hypothermic hearts are irritable hearts. They can go into arrhythmia from something as small as a rough transfer between gurneys. You didn't learn that from a textbook, Fatima said, half question, half statement, watching Casey's hands move with the same unhesitating precision she'd shown treating gunshot wounds and cardiac arrests for the past year, except now aimed at a kind of medicine none of them had ever seen her practice before. I learned it in the Gulf, Casey said, and left it at that, because there would be time later for the rest of the story, and right now, 11 survivors needed hands, not history. Wren pushed through the chaos toward her, umbrella abandoned, rain soaking through his suit jacket within seconds. Ms. Brennan, he started, voice pitched for the reporters now edging closer along the perimeter fence. "I want to publicly apologize for this morning's miscommunication and offer you immediate reinstatement with full—" "Not now," Casey said, not unkindly, simply factually, moving past him toward the next stretcher, where a corpsman was struggling to keep a pediatric patient's IV line secured against the wind. "I have a 9-year-old asking for his mother and 11 other people who don't care about your press conference." She crouched beside Tyler's stretcher, checking his color, his pupils, the return of feeling in his fingers, and found him already improving, shivering hard now instead of dangerously still. The good kind of cold response. "Is my mom here?" he asked, voice steadier than it had been in the water. Casey scanned the arriving stretchers until she found her, a woman on the third gurney, conscious, hypothermic but stable, already turning her head at the sound of her son's voice. "Tyler," the woman croaked, reaching a shaking hand across the gap between stretchers. "Right there," Casey said, guiding his gurney close enough for their fingers to touch, watching something in both of them unclench for the first time since the ferry rolled. "You did the hard part out there, both of you. The rest of this is easy." 2 hours later, with all 11 survivors stabilized and the last of the press finally cleared from the ambulance bay by hospital security, a Navy captain in dress uniform arrived at the emergency department entrance, flanked by Ostrowski, both of them clearly having driven straight from Norfolk the moment the ferry's survivor count had been confirmed. "Petty Officer Brennan," the captain said, extending a hand. "Captain Reyes, Naval Air Station Oceana. I wanted to see this for myself. Command's talking about a commendation for tonight, on top of the one you're already getting for the Sea Fortune rescue this afternoon. 2 in 1 day is not something I've seen in 11 years of service." "I didn't do it for a commendation, sir," Casey said, and meant it, the way she'd meant it every time someone had tried to make today about anything other than the people who were breathing, because she'd refused to let them stop. "I know," Captain Reyes said. "That's usually exactly why we give them." Fatima, standing nearby with a clipboard she'd stopped pretending to look at 10 minutes earlier, finally asked the question that had been building in her since Casey walked back through those doors soaked and unstoppable. "How long were you keeping this a secret?" 3 years, Casey said. "Give or take a lifetime." Casey found herself back in the same office where Wren had fired her that morning, except this time he was the one standing while she sat. "The board wants to offer you a permanent position," Wren said, some of his earlier bravado gone, replaced by something closer to genuine humility, or at least its convincing imitation. "Director of Trauma Response. Full authority to build a mass casualty program from the ground up. Higher salary than you were making. Full apology on the record." Casey considered him for a long moment, thinking about the version of herself who had walked into this office that morning, ready to accept invisibility as a permanent condition, and the version who had spent the day since proving exactly how loud quiet could be when it mattered. "Why now?" she asked. "Be honest. Is this about the 11 people I pulled out of the water tonight? Or is this about the board watching your every move since this morning?" Wren was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, some of the polish had worn off his voice entirely. "Both," he admitted. "I won't pretend the board isn't the reason I'm standing here at midnight instead of asleep. But I watched you work that ambulance bay tonight. I've never seen anyone move through chaos like that in 15 years of hospital administration. I was wrong about you, and I don't just mean the firing. I built an entire performance review system that had no way of measuring the thing you're actually good at, and that's on me, not on you. I already have a job," she said. "The Navy extended my recall. Command wants to talk about bringing me back to active duty, training the next generation of rescue swimmers." Wren's face fell slightly. "I see. But," Casey continued, and watched him look up, surprised. "I told them I'd only come back if I could do it here too. Joint program. Navy rescue swimmers cross-train hospital staff on cold water and mass casualty response. Hospital staff get real field experience they'll never get from a textbook. You get a trauma team that doesn't freeze the next time a ferry rolls 2 miles off your coast. You'd want to work with us? After today?" "I don't forgive easily," Casey said. "But I don't waste good ideas out of spite either. This one's good. Say yes." Wren said yes, because at this point, it was the only sensible answer left available to him, and because Eleanor Voss had already made it very clear what would happen to his position if he said anything else. That night, Driving home alone for the first time since the parking lot, Casey pulled over at an overlook above the same stretch of coast where the Chesapeake runner had gone down hours earlier. The storm had cleared. Stars had come out over water gone calm and dark and, for the moment, harmless. She sat on the hood of her car, still smelling faintly of salt and antiseptic, and let herself feel the exhaustion she'd been outrunning since a folder with her name misspelled had landed on Wren's desk that morning. She thought about Jordan, the way she always did on nights like this, but for the first time in 3 years, the memory didn't arrive wrapped entirely in guilt. She thought about the board of inquiry that had cleared her and the 11 minutes she had spent blaming herself for a system that had failed before she ever hit the water. She pulled her phone out and, for the first time in 3 years, scrolled to Jordan's mother's number instead of letting it sit untouched in her contacts like a wound she refused to let close. She typed a message instead of calling, because some things were still easier in writing. I pulled 11 people out of the water tonight. I thought about him the whole time. I think he'd be glad I went back in. The reply came faster than she expected, at nearly 1 a.m, from a woman who had apparently been waiting 3 years for exactly this message. He'd be so proud of you, Casey. He always said you were the better swimmer. Go be that person. Stop punishing yourself for the one night the ocean won. Casey read it twice, then a third time, and felt something in her chest finally loosen all the way, a knot 3 years in the tying finally coming undone on a quiet overlook above calm water. She thought about Tyler's hand finding his mother's across 2 hospital gurneys, and understood, finally, that surviving something didn't require earning the right to have survived it. I kept going, she said out loud, to nobody, to the water, to a friend who couldn't hear her anymore. I finally kept going instead of just going under with you. The ocean didn't answer. It never had. But for the first time since a night off the coast of Bahrain 3 years ago, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like permission. Respect isn't given by a title, and neither is peace. Both are earned, slowly, one rescue, and one honest choice at a time, by people willing to go back into the cold long after everyone else has decided it's safe to stop looking. The end. That's Casey's story. A woman the world called too cold, who turned out to be the only one warm enough to keep going back into water that would have stopped anyone else. If her story moved you, hit like before you go, and drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest tonight. Subscribe to Secrets of Silent Badges, so you never miss the next quiet person carrying the loudest history. We'll see you in the next one.